The Football Show on Off the Ball.
With Sky. Watch every live Premier League game this season on Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports.
I'm prepared to do anything I can to play for my country again.
Do it then. What about your start to the game?
It wasn't bad, was it?
Why should an honest answer be a mistake?
How can a modern day manager not have a mobile phone?
Why should he?
Dan McDonnell, fresh home from Glasgow. You're very welcome. Of the Irish Independent, of course.
I'm home anyway, not necessarily fresh.
Chastising me. Good trip?
It's fine. I think I got in trouble on Saturday for talking about the sort of drinking habits of the people of Glasgow. I mean, I think I cast aspersions on the character of Glasgow as a city. I like Glasgow. It's a nice place. I was having a debate with a couple of colleagues at the weekend about which city would you prefer, Glasgow or Cardiff, and I was Glasgow all the time. I think I'm done with football trips to Cardiff. I know people from the rugby world go there all the time, or at least every second year, although it feels like with Irish football in recent years we've been going more regularly than every second year to Cardiff, or certainly were for a period of time. But yeah, I actually really enjoyed the match night experience itself. I had been to Hampden Park before for a Scottish Cup final number of years back, and it was okay, but it was that Saturday afternoon cup final vibe. I think Celtic won a little bit of a non-event of a game, so the atmosphere really didn't leave an imprint, whereas being in the stadium on Saturday, just that sort of 10 minutes before kick-off, the old Freed from Desire goes around again, which is now, it's absolutely everywhere. Every football ground I go to now, doesn't matter if it's Scotland or Hungary or wherever they play it, but it was a real proper, that proper big match atmosphere that you only really get, I don't know, once a year, twice, 3 times a year in international games. To be fair, probably the Ireland-Scotland game in the summer here probably had a bit of that too. But under the lights and stuff, there was something about it. So yeah, it was fine. Like sometimes, I don't know, I sometimes like, I enjoy these trips to like Eastern European cities and stuff like that. Too close to home, it's like, it's too much like home.
What did you say about Glasgow's drinking habits?
I think John Duggan or someone made a reference to boozed up fans, and I just made a comment along the lines of, I mean, in Glasgow I think you'd see a lot of boozed up people on the street anyway.
What?
I made the point that a place, and I'm repeating myself here, but anywhere where there's karaoke bars open in the early evening, I mean, that's a party town of sorts.
Shocking thing.
It's very Dublin centric. I mean, do you walk down the street in Dublin to like maybe 5, 6 in the evening and have live karaoke blasting out? 1 or 2 places maybe. Mm-hmm. But it's maybe just to go out early, go home early culture in Glasgow, which does seem to be a thing actually with all those taxi queues. There was big long taxi queues at midnight. So, but they like their social life in Scotland. What harm? I mean, listen, come on, like any reference to Irish people, there's always a reference to a pint of the black stuff. So, I mean, why don't we just...
Well, you just call the people of Glasgow drunken mob.
Well, I just think maybe we should spread some of that shade around. Like it happens to Ireland, so...
I totally agree. The atmosphere came through on the television. It looked amazing. I was very jealous not to be there, and I think whatever about the first iteration under the cloud of COVID, I think this Nations League campaign has really brought it home to everybody. It's a bloody good idea. I mean, we can occasionally say the authorities have put together a very good idea.
I can't believe I'm going to have to pull it. You've forgotten the first iteration of the Nations League, which was, of course, the Martin O'Neill era Nations League.
Oh, we're into our third.
It
took a while to get going.
This was, there was the COVID ones. The first ones was when we seemed to just play Denmark a lot.
Yeah.
And Wales. There was a lot of 0-0 draws, and then that 4-1 in Wales.
But would you agree it's now very much finding its groove?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's found its groove for Ireland, because there was misery. I think from the start of the Nations League, there was other countries having great moments in the Nations League. It just wasn't Ireland, because we barely scored in the competition for the first 12 or 13 games. But you can see it the other night in that stadium. There was points on the line, so can you imagine, I don't know, if there'd been some friendly game and trying to get a result for a previous friendly between Scotland and Ireland? Like, there is meaning. And I think actually Scotland's a good example because, I mean, they ended their major tournament drought via the Nations League route for Euro 2020. Like, they don't need, like, we laugh about it here, like permutations and routes and all this stuff. But Scotland, they have a tangible example of the importance of the Nations League. That's how they got to the Euros.
Yeah.
And again, that they're now in a situation where if they draw against Ukraine tomorrow, you know, they start into a campaign knowing that they're going to be in a playoff no matter what. And even they were singing about England going down. So there was even a bit of like promotion relegation bants, you know. So that's people taking the Nations League seriously. I think now we understand here that while it's a little bit annoying sometimes to go into these permutations talking, I'm not going to do it. Yeah. Like, it is important, you know, these games matter. And I think there's no doubt that it wasn't a manufactured atmosphere on Saturday.
No. So often with Stephen Kenny, we have the big picture conversation and we neglect specifics, and that's probably happened too much over the 2 years. So let's actually, by way of judging the job Kenny did and the players did on the evening, hone in on some details, and let's do that via Gary Breens' article in the Irish Independent today, which is excellent. I actually texted him just to say it was brilliant. You know, we don't have enough of this maybe around Kenny and Ireland at the moment.
I'm biased. I think his columns are good, you know. Yeah, really good.
Yeah. So a couple of points he makes. For instance, this is more of a bigger picture point, but then we'll get into specifics. He says, he argues it's important to stop honing in too much on the fact that Kenny has picked 7 players in that 11 who are aged 23 or under. And he makes the point that this is not a team of the future, it's a team of the present. And this team is actually the best available right now, regardless of their age. So he's saying, in most cases, Kenny's just picking the best player who happens to be 23 or under. A few marginal calls in there. But anyway, we'll proceed on to the game. So he liked, it's funny, I was watching the game with Paul McShane in Virgin, and when the Scottish fullbacks had possession, it was generally Molumby on the right hand side and Knight on the left hand side who sprinted out to close them down, and McLean and Doherty stayed deep. And McShane was kind of thinking, I don't know if I love that. Generally, you know, the orthodoxy would be fullbacks push up and that midfield three stay tight. And his concern, I think what kicked off his concern early on is that Knight went out to close Hickey. Patterson was injured, of course. Knight went out to close Hickey. I think he might have been nutmegged, or the ball got through him anyway.
I remember that, yeah.
And so suddenly that midfield three is now a bit stretched. Knight's out of position because he had to go and close the full back, and Scotland flood that central area and they're in on the Ireland back five. But to be fair, that didn't happen too often and it seemed to work quite well. And Gary Breen really liked this tactic. So he was saying he was happy to see McLean and Doherty deep, part of a very well set back five, and he thought this is great. And he also really liked that the passing for passing's sake under Kenny has been replaced with purpose, his phrase. So where his criticism comes at Kenny and game management is, he talks about the difference in the second half, where Scotland definitely got on top more. So what he says in the Irish Independent is Scotland's full-backs much more positive driving into the space ahead of them in the second half, because you remember the first half they stayed deep.
Yeah.
That made it harder for those two outside central midfielders, so the Knight and Molumby in this instance, to go and engage with the Scottish full-backs because they were coming forward more. Therefore, that job, as in to watch the Scottish full-backs, was left to our wing-backs. And the ripple effect is that a centre-back slides across to make space in the box, and he says all of this is highlighted perfectly in Scotland's equaliser. Yeah. Where it's Doherty versus full-back as opposed to Molumby maybe getting out to the full-back in a deeper position. So, you know, that's a thing that's going to happen in the game. And what he questions on Kenny's part, the substitutions. So he says Christie and Ryan Fraser started to play wider off McGinn, and so McLean and Doherty were drawn out of shape more than they were in the first 45 minutes. That's why my criticism around the substitutes would be it took Stephen Kenny too long to inject fresh legs into the middle. What Ireland needed was that battery power in there to break out and engage those Scottish full backs so that the Irish back five stayed in their original shape. And he acknowledges these are fine margins, but in tight games it's about how you react to situations on the pitch. Like, for instance, we never really, again, these 2 years, and do we pass, do we not pass, progressive tactics, long ball tactics, we have never even had a debate. Is Stephen Kenny good within the 90 minutes? Are his substitutions good? Is he a good line manager? And for Gary Breen, in the context of very tight margins, and there were tight margins. He's saying, well, like, the manager got that part wrong is a big word, but wrong.
Yeah, and see, I think that's the type of I suppose analysis that anyone can appreciate. I do think sometimes like the Kenny referendum thing the debate is so basic sometimes. It's almost like there's a preconceived notions of what about his background in the League of Ireland, or there's this idea he was trying to play it. He wanted to play this beautiful football, which I don't think was necessarily the case. I don't think there's been there's almost a sense of, well, yes, Kenny represents this and another manager represents this, and it's all very broad stuff. And I think at times even I think some of the criticisms of Kenny, there's been valid criticisms there, but never the right ones, if you know what I mean. It's sort of like based on generalities or sort of preconceived notions, or rather than maybe what you're actually seeing in front of you. And I think any staff would probably reflect on a game, and this is more probably the stuff they would look at, you would think. I think there's something in what he said there, and I think sort of Gary obviously has the ex-footballer's eyes to sort of, and he was commentating. He had a great vantage point on Saturday, so probably would have even got a real appreciation of it. And yeah, I think certainly you would speak to people who would have, I suppose, know Stephen Kenny very well and would have followed his career closely. And I think I might have even spoken about it with you at some stage early on in his reign, that like he's always someone who's probably liked quite a settled team, and he's probably had to redraw that a bit in the international sphere, because you can't have the same level of continuity, because just for sort of obvious reasons, games are 2-3 months apart. But secondly, yeah, he wouldn't be someone who'd be known for like making blanket substitutions, or for being one who would make his substitutions too early. It'd be very unusual to see him sort of whipping people at half time, and I'm sure there's examples to disprove that, but in general terms, I don't think it would be unfair to say that he would pick a team. I think he picked the right team on Saturday, and then he sticks with the team, and he's very happy with how that's working. But there's definitely a question to be raised around Saturday as to, could they have made changes quicker? Because certainly, I've had this disagreement with people, but certainly sitting in the ground, I very much felt like Scotland were on top for very much the majority of the second half. I know Ireland had chances, and I know that they had good chances, and if Parrott scores, probably having a different discussion today in its tone. But there was this constant sense of momentum. And to be honest, you talked to a lot of people after, like, what went wrong in the second half? And it wasn't like this player was dreadful, or no one was particularly dreadful. It was 1 or 2 bad moments for players, which I'm sure you can discuss as well too, but it was clear that something needed to be corrected. Yes. And to me, I thought the Obafemi Ogbeni, that's again a very obvious thing to hone on. Why did you take off the player who was doing well and put him on? Like, Ogbeni did fine. I actually think that was the foremost attacker, and I think Obafemi would have struggled for service in the last 20-25 minutes of the game if he'd stayed on with the pattern of the game that as it was continuing. Like, he wouldn't have been able to necessarily influence that dramatically himself. I
agree with you. I expected Parrott to come off just by dint of almost missing the chance, and Obafemi was having some joy. But I think you're right when you say, in terms of the pattern of that second half, which was Scotland getting to grips with it, it doesn't matter if it's Parrott, Obafemi or Ogbeni who are on. They can't interrupt the pattern of the game, and Scotland just got control of it. And like, I dare say Steve Clarke looked at that first half, and experienced, good football manager, he looked at it, and I know that he said, well, if they're going to send Knight and Malumbi out to you two fullbacks all game, bomb on. Like, let's make these lads work. If they're going to invite you on, bomb on, and let's see what they do then. And Gary Breen mentions their midfielders kind of almost drifting out a bit wider, and McGinn to really flood those areas, and let's give these guys a problem. And that's where I suppose you want your manager to respond with something to wrestle back control. And as you said, we're not professional managers, and it's hard to think of what'll do it. Gary Breen's answer was more energy in midfield to at least engage their fullbacks better, because from minute one, if you looked at Knight and Malumbi, you would have said, well, we along 90 minutes trekking out to the wings every time Scottish fullback get the ball, so maybe they were always going to tire.
Yeah, and I think, and what Gary would have pointed out is that the decision would have been to replace Knight or Malumbi, and it might have been a difficult one because they're young, the players themselves would probably feel full of energy. I mean, Molumby, I think, got man of the match on RTE.
Yeah.
But it's I suppose it's a case of sometimes you substitute players who are doing well. It's a case of not needing it to be someone who's sort of perceived to be struggling. I'm not saying Stephen Kenny would react that way at all, but I'm just saying it would have been certainly one that probably would have raised some eyebrows. Can you imagine if the board comes up and Molumby's taken off after 60 minutes? Mm-hmm. That would have been the easy thing to go to if things had gone wrong and say, what was he doing? Mm-hmm. But it eventually they did address that, and Alan Brown was brought in to do that, but it was in the 75th minute, and again, at that stage, I suppose Scotland and Ireland pegged back. There was that series of corners which one of them led to that handball from Brown, which is just, again, one of those things that happened. And that is just, I mean, it's slightly concerning that there was no response to that. And I think Gary also would have made the point that Scotland were actually taking a lot more risks and they were there to be exploited, and Ireland just couldn't break out. And maybe it's one of those momentum things where you concede early in the second half, and that's a bit deflating when you've worked so hard for that first half lead, and then without being conservative and without sort of putting the backs behind the wall, it just becomes a small bit of what we have, we hold. I think another thing as well, Josh Cullen was on a yellow card as well too, which a silly yellow card for kicking the ball away, and then shortly afterwards could nearly have got a second yellow for that late challenge. And he's someone against Ukraine the last time around, I thought he was very good, probably his best game for Ireland. He was snapping around the place. I kind of wonder if he was on a little bit of on that tightrope as well. And I don't know, there was a slight bit more. The midfield three were a little bit more inhibited in the second half, but I also think Scotland moved around them a lot more as well. And
did you get the sense of the game? So, a couple of things. I think everybody was struck by the fact that back three, bar the Hendry header, were excellent. Nathan Collins further underlines his credentials. Obafemi, did a lot of very good things, and there's definitely a semblance of a partnership with him in Parrott and an understanding, and they can play in partnership, which is good. On that midfield 3 point, so undoubtedly worked incredibly hard, as we've been talking about there. This isn't necessarily a criticism, it's just I'm curious for your thoughts. Our best moments in our attack tended to be back to front pretty quickly. And I don't mean necessarily long balls, like I'm talking Darrow Chase, a lovely 20, 30 yard ball even along the ground in the first half through the defence. Collins at those moments. If there was a thought I had in the second half, it was that we're going back to front very quickly, and at times that is creating chances and hurting Scotland, so it's hard to be too critical of it. But there were definitely periods in the second half when Scotland had control of the game. We almost did that a bit too readily, and you would love if that midfield three had almost said, we just won the ball back, instead of feeding one into Obafemi, we might just try and take the sting out of this game a touch. Now, I don't know if that's experience or nous, or maybe they were under strict instructions, no, get it forward, that's the way we hurt them. But that was definitely a feeling watching the game, that Scotland were on top. And when were the periods where Cullen, Molumby and Knight kind of said, we're just going to take the game off you for a couple of minutes here, or even a minute, just to take the sting out? That didn't quite happen. Yeah,
I suppose the thing there, and I mean, and this is not to be excuse making, but this then, to a degree, this comes back to quality of player though in this department too. There's no doubt that where Ireland lack depth at the moment probably is in those midfield positions, the range of talents that they have. I think that's why the expectation is that for the games in November, the friendlies in November, the 21s don't have a game. You might see someone like Will Smallbone brought in. You might see even Conor Coventry brought in with the seniors. That, particularly, I mean, I guess that midfield, the two, Knight and Molumby, probably more so picked for their off the ball work rate as opposed to their on the ball abilities, although Molumby is I think is actually improved on the ball. He had one or two tough moments in the first half, and Knight is a very good player, but he's someone who makes breaks and latches onto attacks, and you don't necessarily have Callum McGregor sort of controls things a small bit more. McTominay, Manchester United. So this comes down to personnel a small bit. I mean, it might have been, and again, he's an unpopular player with sections of the fan base, but it would have been maybe, it's easy to talk about, say, Knight and Molumby, and Brown probably come in to try and do that. Something different will be bringing in Jeff Hendricks, say, who wouldn't be everyone's cup of tea at all, but actually on a good day, and there have been good days under Kenny, a good passer, and he has a bit of a presence, and you would think with his experience, he could have taken a sting out of it at times, which is what you're sort of suggesting, if you know what I mean. Like that, it was a bit frantic, the game in general, and when the game was at its most frantic, Ireland were happy enough, and then the second half, like Scotland just exerted that bit of control with their movement, and I think that's why people are saying, well, why wouldn't you bring Ogbene on for Parrott? It's because Parrott does have some of the attributes as a number 10, although a slight concern about Parrott is he's a small bit, what's his position? Like, where does he stand going forward in this Irish team? Pardon the pun, is that Parrott is someone who is technically quite good and can drop deep and get involved, but maybe he was tired at that stage and he wasn't able to do that. But I think they weren't going to go with, say, two speedsters up front, if you know what I mean, because then they might have had two players out of the game at times, and I think the intention would be that Parrott would come in and maybe sit on their defensive midfielders, but just clearly it wasn't as effective, and as Kenny said himself, it wasn't cohesive, and they weren't able to play through the Scottish press like they did in the first half.
So I think in the main, like in isolation, you'd have to say that was a really good game. Two teams who were better than they were a couple of years ago, playing better brand of football, and Ireland acquitted themselves very well and could have absolutely come away with a draw, and on a different day could have won as well. Parrott scores that goal, you're 2-1 up, you can dig in then. So you can hone in a touch too much on the result, I acknowledge. It was a good performance. Where does that result though fit into the pattern? Because it was something you picked up in the Irish Independent. You were making the point that 90 minutes in and of itself very good, but it does fit into that pattern of taking the lead, for instance, against good teams, Serbia, Portugal, Scotland now, take the lead away from home and just can't quite see it out. Yeah, my thought reading your piece initially was, well, that's a small sample size, just these 3 games. But then you were saying, there's a bit of this at Dundalk as well. And again, it's a small-ish sample size, but you mentioned Tel Aviv, Zenit St. Petersburg, Rosenborg, all these kind of 2-1 close and good performances is what you'd say, but not getting it done.
1-1 is our national scoreline. Is an entertaining 2-1 defeat better than a boring 1-1 draw? Like this is.
I would say yes.
Yeah, I don't know. Like that's I know you had a bit of that chat, I think, with Dion and Keith Tracy and Shane Keegan.
But it's
yesterday.
funny. Keith Tracy was so good yesterday because he said, we would have had a better chance of winning that game on Saturday if we'd been horrible.
Yeah, I know.
He said horrible with a certain emphasis.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Kenny's obviously won a lot of games too, right? But I guess it's this whole thing of, what do these valiant defeats mean, right? You have to all believe that they're on the road to something, and this is where I broadly agree with a lot of Gary Breens' points. I would think about the 723 thing is that they may be the best players now, but they weren't necessarily all the best players when they were picked first by Ireland, if you know what I mean. I think certainly, when the likes of, say, Malumbi, he springs to mind, was dropped into the team first. He wouldn't have been playing very much at Brighton, had loan spells. He would have been behind Conor Hourihane probably at that stage, or Hendrick, a few players. Now I think now, they've caught up and probably overtaken them.
I agree with you. But it's also not unreasonable to think they'll be better at 25. But anyway,
yeah, absolutely. And I think what you want to believe is that some of these defeats, like Portugal, like Serbia, like for Portugal, I'm talking about substitutions. Remember Portugal, one of the best things about Portugal, and Kenny got praise in the aftermath, was when someone went off injured, Dara O'Shea, and he brought on a Mobile Videlli rather than necessarily relocating for experience. So that was brave. That was an example of a very good substitution. But the hope is that this is the body of experience that it means that when you're in these pressure games next year, that if you take the lead, you don't cede it, because how many times we talk about the first goal being the most important thing in international football games, and now it's not.
That payoff is kicking in next year, definitely, is it? Because I was kind of hoping that we'd be saying after Hampden Park, well, you see the experience of Serbia, Portugal. So when is that kicking in?
Joe, that's the valid concern. It's not that is the valid concern, and I can understand that concern, that until you do it, people won't believe that's the thing.
We'll come on to the fallout in part 2 of the chat here. We'll go to an outbreak in a moment. But that would be Damien Delaney's concern. Where's the evidence that this is all kicking in next year at this very vital European qualification stage, or will we just continue in this vein?
Yeah. Now, I suppose within Serbia one was certainly. Listen, Serbia one was a bit ragged in the second half. Portugal. I guess what I'm saying is there a pattern between all these games. Portugal, I suppose, there was a thing about defending crosses. If you remember, James McLean come on in that game, and he actually probably got done once on that side, and again, crosses into the box. you would like to think, you can efficiently manage that. Like in a way, it's this whole thing of you want to be beaten by moments of individual brilliance, not goals that you think you can defend. And I think like the concession of bad goals, again, in isolation, Alan Brown thing shouldn't happen, or one of those things. But obviously they stack up if there's a count, and against the smaller teams, there's this recurring thing of shots from outside the box, and against the better teams, it's defending stuff in the area, and you're thinking, okay, can this be corrected over? Like the thing is, the Euros campaign is probably going to come down to like 3 or 4 matches. If Ireland end up in a group of 5, it's going to be like, we now know there'll be 2 higher ranked teams. You'll play them. That's a total of 4 games. Ireland have played well pretty much in all of these games against these nations. Yeah. And yet the margins, the only one where they've probably squeezed something out of the fine margins was the Ireland-Serbia game in Dublin, where they probably should have been hammered, and did the opposite to what they've done, where they took more out of that game than they probably should have. But a lot of times it's like, that was great, but, and it's like, giving it a real go, picking the right team. I think in a lot of instances, I think you find it hard to argue with how Ireland have started a lot of games. Right. But it's and that speaks to something in terms of preparation. But maybe we're coming around full circle. It's the management of the games, and sometimes game management that definitely might point to the experience thing as well. And you think they'll become more consistent over time. But obviously there comes a point where, maybe this brings you to Damien Delaney, where you get impatient for that lack of consistency developing.
Well, I suppose it means you pitch up in March in hope rather than expectation, rather than, we've really seen the last 6 months they've got to grips with these tight games. We're now saying, well, we still haven't, but maybe it's just about to happen in March. That's the... Yeah,
I think he needs in March. The draws on Sunday week. I think he needs to end up in one of these 6-team groups as well, because they've ended up in 5-team groups. The whole win ratio thing. You want, if they had a 6-team in the group and have a nice, the easiest start you can possibly have.
Like Armenia.
To get, Armenia away are a different animal to, get a couple of points on the board and just grow into the campaign. Because as you've said, so many campaigns have been over early.
Well, that's been a problem.
And to actually the order of games, I think next year, get a bit of momentum going and have those harder games later on. But that's all just luck.
I want to touch about some of the fallout. We'll take a quick break. There's some texts and comments coming in, which I'll get to as well in just a moment. The football show is brought to you by Sky. Watch every live Premier League game this season on Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports. Back with Dan McDonnell in just 1 second.
Football on Off the Ball.
With Sky, get all the football you love in one place across Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports.
Football on Off the Ball.
With Sky. Watch Premier League, Women's Super League, EFL, Scottish Premiership and much more. Live on Sky Sports.
Now you're welcome back. I think Kenny doing well in terms of style of play, says MJPK, with the standard of players available to him. Problem is we don't have the standard of players available to succeed consistently, is regular sentiment.
I just think maybe you're just conscious of being cast as madly pro Kenny all the time. I think that is a valid point. I think relative to relative to standard of where players play, Ireland. I did a piece on Saturday looking at the squads. There's no way you can look at it and say that the Scottish squad isn't better than the Irish squad. Now, in saying that, I think some of the Irish squad in a couple of years' time, I think it might read on paper like a pretty decent squad. They just haven't all necessarily got to the ceiling of where they're going to go.
Patrick McHugh. All right, Joe, it's a good performance, but Ireland right now are the definition of spinning their wheels. We are going nowhere. It's so frustrating. All I've heard for the last 2 years, quote unquote, improvement, is another text in. So they're the different sentiments. On the fallout, it's quite striking. Liam Brady seems to have come fully on board with Stephen Kenny, and he was one of the most ardent critics, I thought, in the initial year, 18 months. And he was very positive about Saturday night. I was on Virgin Media with Paul McShane and Dame Delaney, and McShane had reservations. I would say Delaney had strong criticism of Kenny, and his sense was, paraphrasing him as best I can, but his sense was, okay, we're 2 years in here, and Grant, he's given 16 debuts and development, but the national team is also about results, and at what point are the results coming, and has there been enough progress made? And he said, I don't go into next year with any confidence, really. There's no, the vulnerabilities haven't been ironed out. Brian Kerr similarly critical as well. So think in the main it's been positive. What's very striking, I kind of wanted to ask you, is that I do, I thought Ger was talking to Nathan this morning in OTB AM, and he just kind of made that point. Well, they were having the broad conversation, what do we want the Irish football team to be? And you would like it to represent Irish football. And I think that's why the style that Kenny is really pushing versus like the style under Mick McCarthy in the most recent campaign, as opposed to when he got to the World Cup in 2002 and he had better players then, admittedly. But that latest McCarthy campaign was grim. It was just awful football. I sat in that stadium so many times and I just thought, we're not even trying to play football.
I
here.
will say, like, I think that's a small bit harsh, and it tailed off badly towards the end. I think that is forgotten. I know that they had a bit of a go against Denmark in the last day, but like that double header against Georgia, Switzerland was bad. But they played okay away to Denmark. But I take your general point. The tennis ball night against Georgia wasn't.
Yeah, it was such bad football. There were periods of play where I sat there and thought, what are they even trying to do? What have they been asked to do? This is really bad. Whereas Kenny has changed all that. So I think, again, back to that point of it's representing Irish football. That side of things, I can really get behind it. I really like it. I would just think increasingly, and of late, Stephen Kenny's public dispatches are far too defensive, and it's like a campaign trail. Almost every question is turned into an array of statistics which justify me keeping my job. And I don't know what you think about that. You're seeing it more often than I am, but I just feel like every interview there's a real degree of self-justification about it, and I don't think he needs to do that anymore. I think he should leave that phase behind.
Yeah, I do understand. I understand that argument. Yeah.
Do you agree with it?
Yeah, I think there's definitely. And I'm trying to think back to like covering Stephen Kenny previously, and I think probably the Dundalk European campaign and stuff, like the sort of bigger picture answer stuff, the stuff about like, European, this team is connecting with people. He would have said that stuff then too when he wasn't now maybe he was campaigning to be Ireland manager one day and some sort of weird, and some weird thing. So I think some of that is just part of his, how he handled with press stuff. But in general, and I wouldn't like overanalyze that too much, like, all this stuff tends not to be important when you're winning, but obviously if you're not winning, then people will analyse what you're saying more, and they will find aspects of it grating if they're hearing the same thing again and again. Like if Ireland are winning, it's just like everything seems charming or something, Sure. But I do wonder sometimes, is it a product of being, like we talk about this Kenny referendum, but I suppose he's been living it, and there has been an element of this campaign mode from the start, like from the very start of his tenure. Like he started in September 2020, he started in April, but his first match was in September 2020, and within 7 or 8 games he was facing the questions about, are you the man for the job? Sure. Are you the man to start the next campaign or the next campaign? And there's no doubt that at times he's probably used the press conference to try and change the narrative away from maybe this thing and the here and now to look further down the line. It's where the winning the Nations League comment came out of, really. It was that night against Qatar. Yeah. And it's projecting something that's coming down the tracks, which obviously leads people to become more frustrated when you get down the tracks and you haven't quite arrived at that place just yet. Now, the stat stuff to me, like in some ways I think it's harsh that like with this manager, and I'm not sure if it was the case with previous ones. I don't know if in the end of Martin O'Neill's third campaign we were talking about how many games you've won in your last 40 matches. It was very much in the here and now, but maybe that's because he had the credit in the bank from qualifying for a tournament. But this whole thing of like you've only won X and this and like win ratios and stats and stuff, they tell a degree of the story, but I always would have said that when Kenny came in, that there was a sense that you did probably have to maybe accept that once in our life, once in Ireland's boom and bust cycle, you have to sort of write off a campaign a bit. Mm-hmm. This was the one thing that we were going to do that we've never done. Other nations like Wales go back a decade and stuff, it was dreadful. You have to accept that. So now, like I think sometimes when people are sort of going on about his win record from games in 2020 and COVID times and adding that into the round and the whole, I'm just like, I feel a little bit sympathy from there. Now the short term is they've lost 3 of the last 5 Nations League games. Yeah. That's a much more pressing statistic that I don't think he can really, and then he starts saying we've lost 3 in 16, and it's like, no, but you've lost 3 of your last 5 games. I think that's more. I think go back to the dragging in 2020 stuff and the playoff against Slovakia,
ancient history,
which they probably should have won anyway. Like that to me is a little bit like Ireland. As I said, Ireland were in a 5-team group. If they got a 6-team group, they would have played maybe Andorra, probably beaten them twice. You'd have a little bit better percentages, but what's it mean? Nothing, right? Yeah. So like I think people will. Stephen Kenny is probably responding to people who find stats that suit their argument by finding stats that suit his argument.
He should be above all that. You should leave all
stuff
that
the other night about, I mentioned this in the piece today, going on about the 44,000 people potentially going to the Armenia game tomorrow. I don't believe that there will be 44,000 people there at all, and I don't think it's a failure if there isn't. I think if there's like 35,000 people there on a Tuesday night in a school week, it's not bad. But because he's got this information, thinking maybe all season ticket holders will show up, he feels the need to say these 44,000 people coming is reflective of the support that exists out there for us. He doesn't need to do that. Like, he doesn't actually need, and he just leaves himself open to a little jab if that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it was just funny. Like, even Vincent Hogan was in the paper review yesterday, and he was saying like he didn't think it was great that Kenny's point after the Scotland game was the Alan Brown penalty wasn't a penalty. That was the
and it was a penalty.
Oh, like, yeah. I mean, it couldn't be more of a penalty, really. And like again, tomorrow, I don't think if they beat Armenia 4-0, I don't think that should be spun as well. This shows.
No, I hope not. I hope not. Yeah,
just a degree of like, let's deal with the here and now, and almost just be a bit more positive and seem like you're enjoying the job. And I'm the figurehead of Irish football, as opposed to, well, here's me defending myself again, even though it's an innocuous question about how the game was tonight. You know?
Yeah,
I'm being a bit harsh on him, but it's just it's a pattern.
No, I see what you're saying. I think you would have hoped that when he'd got the contract that would have been the line in the sand to sort of move on. But of course, they didn't then lose away to Armenia and home to Ukraine, which removed, so it would probably put him back into fight mode then, because going to the Scotland match, there was again stuff about these shadowy board members who were apparently well and ready to change their mind.
Yeah.
But again, and like a lot, and the Nations League games, I'm not going to go back on myself. They are very important. They do matter. Like finishing third in the group for Ireland tomorrow, like it really does matter. But I think from the start of the Kenny era, and there's obviously some people would take umbrage with the fact that he got that playoff against Slovakia, it was always going to be about, is he going to qualify Ireland for the Euros in 2024?
Sure.
It's all been building up to next year, and my argument is he will live or die by next year. I'm pretty sure privately he would admit he will live or die by next year. Like, I don't think he's going to get, like, I don't know what would have to happen. You know, you'd have to sort of have a Thierry Henry style sort of bad luck, I think, you know, to not qualify for the Euros and yet retain the rumper support that he has now, you know. So in some ways you wonder, is the Kenny debate and the whole thing a victim of this quite unusual drag in the international calendar that now exists, with the World Cup, this year's World Cup being moved to winter, which has created this long void between like meaningful campaign games, which just leaves a void for talk.
Yes and no.
You know?
Yes and no. I think, yes, you make a fair point. No would be, well, you win in Yerevan and you're vying for top spot in this group. True. And everyone says, okay, we're motoring here and the football's great and there's a lot to love about the team. There's so much to love about what Kenny's doing and what the team are doing. It's just accept the results. And it's you're on the spectrum then of how important are the results to you. Like, it was even interesting yesterday. Dion Fanning was in here and Keith Tracy was in here, and Dion was saying, for me, it's about so much more than the results. You know, and the team are entertaining, and I like going to see this team versus previous years. And for him, that counts very significantly next to we lost to Armenia away in the midst of this Nations League campaign. Whereas Keith's maybe that hardened, grizzled professional.
The ex-pro who's been there.
The ex-pro is like, some of the ex-pros I sense are looking on at the rope that Kenny has been given in absolute bemusement.
I know.
They cannot get. They're like, some of them are chatting to you at times. They're like, what's going on here? When did all this become acceptable?
I know, but I suppose, like, is there any, like, a lot of the ex-pros now are probably I suppose the larger volume of them would have probably played for like Trapattoni's Ireland, right? I think the ones that are in their sort of
40s.
They're coming into their late 30s, early 40s, and they would have lived through that time where the team performed reasonably well without maybe necessarily being loved. I mean, I don't know, is that dramatic? You know, they would have been loved to a point, but it was like there still would have been like jibes about going to somebody's games.
Yeah.
You know, like there would have been sort of, oh, we have to go and watch this or whatever, even when the team was competitive. Now, like, and I can completely understand if you felt at that time you were hard done by because you'd achieved certain things, and then you come out and you see a team doing less and sort of getting away with more. But then the flip side is that generation had a much better squad. Like they could talk about the players in their dressing room.
Sure.
I think
that generation as well, and it was probably more media talk than Stephen Kenny saying it, but I think in advance of him taking the job, I think they also had a degree of bemusement with the sense that Ireland were going to play samba football from the 70s.
He said some stuff himself too, to be fair, Kenny, that definitely fueled that.
And I think there was a degree of, hang on, one, we played very, very good football on occasions, a lot of those former players would say, but also two, you just wait until you see what it's like, and you're against very good teams and very good managers. Wait and you see what it's like out there.
But see, my point in that is that I always expected Kenny teams to end up being pragmatic. I sometimes thought that what he was saying and the philosophy of what he was saying didn't reflect what the reality was going to be. Like, this is my point. You hear people speaking now as though, did they imagine that Stephen Kenny, when he was with Dundalk in 2016, that if they didn't watch the games, that they were passing the ball around the whole time? No, they did a lot of stuff that the Irish team are doing now. He's done it before. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not... I think, as I said, I think sometimes that's where you end up with these very simplistic definitions of what he stands for, based on a half assumption of what his theory is, you know?
Few texts coming in. Laser Snake makes the point.
How's a message from Laser Snake gonna go?
I'm guessing that's more from the online sphere than a text into 53106. Laser Snake says, why is it so hard to understand the opinion that someone other than Kenny would do a better job? The options are not Kenny or hoofball. Very fair point.
I know what you're saying, and I don't think, like, I think there's probably, I mean, you think about it, right? There's very few Irish managers working in the UK at the moment as well too. We had a little bit of a void there for a period of time of coaches and stuff. I think there's probably, like, you know, why did Ireland for a period of time, why were they turning to sort of managers sort of at the latter end of their career? Whereas I feel like in the next 5 to 10 years, there probably is a generation of Irish coaches coming through, you know, in various places who I think we might have more of a production line of prospective managers without needing to. I don't think we're going to have to go back to that day of, like, let's throw a big check to a big name to give us a sprinkle of sort of stardust to sell tickets.
We don't have a big check either.
No.
So somebody says, look at the players we have. They're lower level championship standards, so we're getting lower level championship results. Jerry O'Malley says, huge concern that the next campaign will follow the last 3 campaigns. Terrible results against Luxembourg, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Bulgaria, always fighting to not finish last. Kenny needs to find that winning mentality fast, is a point Jerry makes. I mean,
well, that's where tomorrow is important.
I would agree with that.
To prove, like, see, tomorrow is completely different to Saturday. There's 2 different types of tests that probably Ireland need to show they can negotiate. One is the tight margin away game where they're competitive, and how do you see out the promise of what you've done?
Hampden Park game.
And the second one is
Luxembourg.
Just like really stamping on the neck of someone at home.
It did it against Qatar. That was the one where I thought, and again, it's this roller coaster with Kenny of ups and downs. The Qatar game was one. I remember tweeting that night, something really good is happening. I tweeted that. Something really good is happening with this team, because I'd never seen an Irish team stand on the neck of a lesser team like that. And then
it was a friendly.
Yes, but even so, there was a panache there and a style there and a fluidity there that we don't always have, even in friendlies against Leicester.
No, I probably thought the same. That was the night I think he came out and said the Nations League proclamation.
We were all a bit high that
yeah,
night.
Everyone got caught up in it. But like, Armenia will probably operate in a low block tomorrow, and I think like Steve Clark spoke at the weekend, even Martin O'Neill was speaking about a Premier Sports, but Ireland suddenly have pace and attack, like they're a counter-attacking team, which is a slight different change in language to how teams would have spoken, you know, people would have spoken about Ireland, but actually a lot of those attributes aren't what you necessarily need against Armenia at home, and you have to find different ways to win in different scenarios. That's the nature of a qualifying campaign. Like Stephen Kenny would argue that Ireland needed to change their style of play to have a chance going away against these teams.
Yeah.
But what he hasn't got right is the ability to mop up the points at home to give you a platform to have a chance in a group.
Tell me this. So I mentioned some of the comments from Kerr and Delaney and McShane and Liam Brady. you were watching Martin O'Neill on Premier Sports?
I did. I recorded it, so I watched it last night.
I haven't seen it. I got the impression from your Twitter feed that he was incredibly chippy.
Well, no, it was just one tweet. Well, I mean, they've always been I think Martin O'Neill. Listen, everyone who leaves a job, like probably in any walk of life, like if they've ever been replaced, might sort of carry some sort of torch over.
What did he say?
But I think generally he was quite complimentary of the Irish performance.
What did he say?
But where he was snippy was around, Matt Doherty's performance, which isn't surprising because Matt Doherty gave that radio interview after he left where he said the training was terrible, Roy Keane did nothing. We didn't even know what our plan was half the time. So I think Roy Keane had his bite back at Matt Doherty last year, and O'Neill waited for his moment. And there was I did post up a clip, probably illegally, of they're having a chat about the defending and Alan Hutton and I think Richard Dunn. Well, he hasn't been playing games at club level. What could he expect? And O'Neill just waited. He couldn't. No, that's what happens when you can't defend. Which was and then later in the clip, later in the coverage, it shows Doherty making a goal line clearance. And I think Michael Stewart, one of the other pundits, says, did he defend well there, Martin? It was a little bit unhappy. But then they showed the footage of the Ireland goal. So while he was quite complimentary generally, it showed the John Egan goal, and O'Neill said something along the lines of, yeah, they scored a goal from a set piece. That was frowned upon when I was in charge, but now it seems to be okay. Funnily enough. Okay. He spoke about Kenny's selective memory. So there was a couple of little jabs in there. But I think overall, again, like in isolation, I don't think anyone was going to, I don't think it was the night to sort of to say this is this team is a rabble. I think maybe that's the broader thing with it as well. Like I've covered in like the end of days of various regimes where you then have this, and you look at a game and you're like, those players are mentally gone. This team is gone. They've lost faith in the manager, or and you can't say that. Like you can't say that watching these games. No. Now it doesn't mean he's the answer and he's going to succeed, but it's different. It's not that of it's glaringly, staring
totally
you
agree.
in the face.
They're very
and
much.
That's the dilemma. That's what actually probably creates this debate where no one maybe is wrong.
There's no dilemma. Everybody is in agreement. He gets the Euros campaign.
I think that. Well, I don't think everyone's in agreement, Joe. I'm pretty sure. I'm sure you'd find plenty of people who would say no, but I think that's what's going to happen. So,
I would have thought most now would be nuanced enough to see the progress and say, well, he deserves a crack at the Euros.
If Ireland lost, if Ireland lost against Armenia tomorrow, you'll have I suppose results will always change the debate. Like you'll have people coming on saying, "Oh, yeah." No, I don't think that would actually change it. I still think you'd get the campaign anyway.
On Armenia, by the way. So I know you said a couple of their better players are back. They were beaten 5-0 by Ukraine on Saturday, and their coach Joaquin Caparo was in a tussle against local media after the game. I was reading Aidan Fitzmaurice was reporting on it. So he's Spanish. He's been there since 2020, 66 years of age. They've conceded 14 and scored 1 in the last couple of games. So on Saturday post-match, local journalists refused to ask any questions of Caparrós and said, you just have to resign right now, right here, on the spot.
Yeah.
Not behind closed doors, like resign. We're not asking questions. And he responded by saying, my contract runs out at the end of November and I'm not leaving before then. And so the media walked out. Now, if we don't beat this lot in Dublin...
you think you've had it hard, right? I'm pretty sure Stephen Kenny would have been annoyed by certain stuff, but I'm not sure if I've ever been in a scenario where someone has refused to leave a press conference.
Will you have the guts to demand he resign on the spot if we don't qualify?
But if you don't do this, I'm not even going to ask you about that penalty decision. I'm going to ask nothing. Like we're having
no questions.
There was no talking here.
So they're arriving at a low ebb for sure. Can we mention the under-21s in the 90 seconds we have left? I mean, we really should. Tel Aviv, 6:15 kick-off tomorrow. 1-1 draw in the first leg. Jim Crawford said he was definitely disappointed, felt we were the better team. There was an Evan Ferguson equaliser. His injury concern has been allayed, so he will be okay to play. By all accounts, Aaron Connolly, very, very good in that game. So they go to Tel Aviv. 1-1.
Yeah, hopefully there'll be loads of time to talk about the 21s if they can get the job done, and it really will open doors for them. I watched most of it. I was in Glasgow, but I was able to see sort of most of the game. I thought they played quite well. There's a slight concern. I think it's 30-degree heat over there. Israel, it's just that's reverting to like dreadful cliche and stereotype, but you just imagine at home, they'll be a little bit more comfortable that they've got some of their first team players involved. Because they don't have anything really riding on their last Nations League game. So it will be difficult. But But I think, Crawford's team, they've gone away to Sweden before, rode their luck a bit, but actually have shown an ability to sort of defend situations. I'm just worried they're missing one or two key players who've been big players for them across the camp. Like they were throwing in a couple of guys for debuts on Friday at that level, which for a big playoff game isn't necessarily ideal. They've had a lot of transition across the campaign and they've done an amazing managerial job as a consequence.
It's the nature of underage football.
Yeah, it seems even more pronounced in this instance.
And Conley was very much up for it and happy to be back in that fold. Yeah,
he's living up to his words. I mean, it's early days, but it's funny, you still drop someone who's had a bad time at senior level into 21s level, and you think, no, he still played at a higher level than a lot of these. Some of the movements, the position he took up, he's unlucky not to score. And he gives you a threat away from home. If you are, I think they're going to have to soak up a fair bit of pressure in that game. But I give them a fighting chance. I sort of have the niggling feeling they needed to bring a lead there to do it, but I hope to be wrong on that, and I hope that it kicks tomorrow evening off on a major high.
Thank you very much for coming in. I will see you tomorrow at the Aviva Stadium. Dan McDonnell of the Irish Independent. Our football show coverage brought to you by Sky. Watch every live Premier League game this season on Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports.
Football on Off the Ball.
With Sky, get all the football you love in one place across Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports.